The night was silent. No footsteps echoed through the cobbled streets. No dogs barked. No voices carried across the square. Then, without warning, the first toll came, a deep metallic strike that rolled through the valley like thunder. The villagers froze where they stood. Some clutched at their chests, others bowed their heads as if waiting for the sound to pass through them. The second toll followed, then the third. Slow, deliberate, each one spaced with a dreadful patience. The people did not look at the church tower, for none dared raise their eyes. They had lived with this ritual too long. Every night the bells rang. No man pulled the rope. No priest remained in the church. Yet at midnight, the sound came without fail. 13 times it rang. Always 13, never 12, never 14. The people whispered that 13 was not a number, but a warning. A message from something unseen, something that had taken root in the walls of St. Aurelia's church. Long ago, the church had been a sanctuary. Its bell had once called farmers in from their fields, had once announced weddings, births, the rare days of joy that marked the rhythm of a hard life. Now, it had become a wound in the sky. Each night, it bled sound across the sleeping world, and no one could stop it. Children learned to count before they could read, because they grew up listening to those tolls. They counted them in silence, lips moving in the dark. When the 13th strike faded into the distance, mothers let out the breath they had held, and fathers murmured prayers that no one had taught them. Travelers spoke of it as a curiosity. They told stories in distant cities about the haunted bells that rang in the empty tower. Some came to witness it, laughing at the superstition, mocking the fear of villagers who hid behind their shutters. But when midnight came, laughter died. Faces turned pale. And when the 13th toll rolled out into the night, those travelers left before dawn. They never returned. The villagers did not laugh. They had seen too much. They had lived in the shadow of that sound, their lives pinned to its rhythm like moths caught against glass. They knew the tolls were not an echo of old wood and iron. They knew something moved inside the church that no one could see. What was it that reached down to the rope each night? What hand, flesh or otherwise, pulled until the sound shook the valley awake? No priest had set foot inside the bell tower for centuries. No villager dared climb its stairs. The fire that had gutted the church left its stones blackened and its altar broken. The tower itself should have collapsed long ago, yet it stood, unbroken, holding fast to its secret. Some said it was the voice of the dead acolyte, the boy who had lived in the tower and who had died when the flames cut off his escape. Others whispered it was the priest himself, who had cursed his people before the fire swallowed him. A few believed it was not a man at all, but the weight of sins buried beneath the church, pressing up through the stones until they found release in sound. Whatever the truth, the fact remained. Midnight came. The bells tolled, 13 times, always 13. The villagers no longer asked why. The question had hollowed them long ago. But for the traveler, for the stranger who dared linger in the square when the hour approached, the question always rose. It gripped the throat. It burned behind the eyes. It demanded to be spoken. Who rings a bell when no one is left alive to pull the rope? The village was small, pressed between the ridges of a valley where mist lingered like smoke long after dawn. Fields stretched outward in neat strips, divided by stone walls that had stood for centuries. Life here had always been measured by seasons, by harvests, by the rhythm of birth and burial. The people knew hardship. They lived close to the earth, and they relied on their faith to endure it. At the center of the village rose St. Aurelia's church. Its stones were hauled from a quarry 3 miles away, dragged by oxen and bound together with mortar that had long since blackened. The tower soared above the houses, casting a shadow that moved across the square as the day passed. For generations, it had been the one place where the entire community gathered. The church was not simply a building, it was a promise of protection. In those years, bells were more than tools. They were voices. They carried messages across valleys and hills. They called men to worship, warned of storms, marked the hour of death. To the villagers, the bell of St. Aurelia's was the sound of order. It told them that life continued, that the world was held in place by ritual and prayer. But that order fractured. The fire that consumed the church came without warning. One night in the late 14th century, smoke rose into the sky and flames swallowed the roof. The villagers formed chains with buckets of water, but the heat forced them back. Within hours, the sanctuary that had stood for generations was nothing more than scorched stone. The altar cracked, the wooden pews became ash, and the paintings of saints melted from the walls. When morning came, only the tower remained. Its blackened spire pierced the sky like a charred finger pointing upward. Inside, the great iron bell still hung, The rope beneath it was burned, but the bell itself had not fallen. The tragedy carved a wound in the community. The church was never rebuilt. Families whispered that it had not been an accident. Some said the priest had cursed them during his final sermon, furious at the villagers for abandoning their vows. Others insisted that a hidden sin had poisoned the congregation and the fire had been divine punishment. Children grew up hearing these stories until they became as solid as stone. For years, the people avoided the ruins. They buried their dead in silence, prayed at home, and kept their distance from the broken altar. Yet no matter how far they walked, the tower was always there, looming above the rooftops. Then came the first toll. No one remembered the exact year, but they remembered the moment, midnight, a silence so deep that even the crickets hushed. And then the sound of the bell, clear, deep, carrying over the valley as though the tower still commanded the village. At first, they believed it was a trick, some echo of the past. But the sound came again the next night, and the night after that, always at midnight, always 13 strikes. It became the heartbeat of the place. No one controlled it, yet no one could escape it. Children were born into its rhythm. Farmers paused their work when the evening fell, waiting for the sound to pass before they returned to their fields. Families closed their shutters tightly, as if the toll could not pass through wood and glass. The emotional weight of the bells pressed down on the community like a curse. The sound reminded them of fire, of death, of faith betrayed. No matter how many generations passed, the villagers could not forget that their sanctuary had burned, leaving only an empty shell. The tolls were not a call to worship. They were reminders. They pulled at the memory of something terrible, something unresolved, something that had taken root in the foundation of the tower. Even as the world changed beyond the valley, the village did not. Roads expanded, wars raged, kingdoms rose and fell, but St. Aurelia's tower stood, tolling at midnight, marking time in a way that felt both precise and eternal. For the villagers, there was no escaping it. Their history was written in sound. The bell was not simply metal, it was a wound, an accusation, a voice that refused to fall silent. And still the question lingered. Was it only memory that made the bell ring? Or was something alive within the stones of the church, waiting for those who dared listen? The bells did not stop. As years became decades and decades turned to centuries, the sound remained. Always at midnight, always 13 tolls. It became a wound stitched into the fabric of the village, a ritual no one could deny, though no one dared explain. At first, the villagers attempted to ignore it. They told themselves it was the wind or perhaps the sound of iron expanding and shifting in the cold. But each night the toll was too clear, too deliberate. The pattern never changed. The bells rang with the same slow rhythm, as though someone unseen stood inside the tower, pulling the rope by hand. Stories began to spread. Farmers returning late from their fields swore they saw the rope move inside the tower's shadow. They described it swinging back and forth, pulled with a force that could not be explained. Yet when dawn came, the rope was still. The clapper inside the bell showed no sign of motion. Children woke screaming in the night, insisting they had heard the toll from inside their own homes, as if the sound had slipped beneath the door and rung directly in their ears. A woman once swore she felt her bed shake with each strike. Another claimed the glass of her window trembled, though no wind stirred outside. Contradictions multiplied. Some said the sound echoed through the valley like thunder. Others claimed it seemed to ring from inside their very chest, vibrating bone and blood rather than air. A few insisted it was not the sound of iron at all. They said it was the sound of voices, stretched and distorted until they became metallic. Travelers who dared stay in the village carried their own stories back into the world. One spoke of seeing shadows climb the tower steps at midnight, though no person entered. Another described the bell tolling with such violence that the entire tower shook, though no villager heard it. There were nights when outsiders swore the bell struck 14 times, or even 15, yet every villager counted 13. The church itself became a place of dread. By day, its walls seemed harmless, only another ruin left behind by time. But by night, the air grew colder near the tower. Those who lingered too close spoke of a pressure in the chest, as though the air had thickened. Some described a sensation of being watched from the upper windows, though the glass had long since shattered. In the winter months, when snow covered the roofs and frost crept up the windows, the bells seemed louder. The valley air carried them farther, into neighboring villages. There too, people heard the toll, and some refused to travel near St. Aurelia's again. The place was marked, they said, marked and abandoned by God. By the 19th century, skeptics arrived. Journalists, priests, and even military men walked into the square with notebooks and lanterns. They stood at the base of the tower as midnight approached, confident that they would expose the legend for what it was. But each night ended the same way. One officer wrote in his journal that when the first toll struck, he felt it not in his ears, but in his lungs. He described the sensation as drowning in sound. Another investigator claimed the tower rope jerked so violently that it tore loose splinters of wood from the beam above, though when they inspected it in daylight, the wood was intact. Not all who came returned unchanged. A soldier who once laughed at the villagers' fear collapsed 2 weeks after his visit. He was found in his bed, gasping the word confess over and over until he died. A priest who swore he would climb the tower and end the ritual was discovered the next morning at the church's base, his body twisted as though he had fallen, though no one had seen him ascend. For the villagers, these contradictions only deepened the terror. If outsiders, with their faith and their science, could not silence the bells, then perhaps nothing could. The questions multiplied, each more disturbing than the last. Why did the tolls never change? Why did no storm, no war, no decay silence them? What hand reached across centuries to pull the rope when all others had turned to dust? And if it was not a hand at all, then what force waited inside the tower, striking 13 times every night without fail? Investigators did not abandon St. Aurelia's. Each new century brought fresh attempts to uncover the truth, yet each effort only deepened the uncertainty. Reports, journals, and testimonies began to accumulate. Together they formed a record of obsession. Men and women who entered the valley certain they could explain the tolls and who left it changed forever. One of the earliest written accounts came from a traveling priest in the 17th century. He described standing in the square, lantern raised, as the bells began their ritual. He wrote that the sound carried across the valley not as a chime, but as a vibration in the very air. He claimed his lantern flickered with each toll, the flame shrinking as if smothered by an unseen breath. By the 13th strike, the lantern had gone out completely. A century later, a soldier stationed nearby left his own record. He noted that he had climbed the tower at dusk to inspect the bell. He found it silent, motionless, the rope frayed with age but intact. He waited there until midnight. When the tolls began, he swore that the bell itself did not move. He touched the iron as the sound rolled across the valley, and he felt no vibration. The bell was silent to the touch, yet deafening to the ear. By the 19th century, the arrival of recording devices added another layer to the puzzle. Early phonographs captured the midnight tolls, yet when the cylinders were examined, the sound was not what had been expected. Analysts claimed the recording did not match the natural resonance of iron. Instead, the frequency resembled that of the human voice, stretched, distorted, as if dozens of voices cried out in unison. Some listeners swore they could hear words buried beneath the metallic tone. One fragment, played backward, carried a single word, repeated over and over. Confess. Artifacts also emerged from the ruins. Excavations around the church floor revealed charred remains buried beneath the stones. Many were bound at the wrists and ankles, suggesting they had not died in the fire by accident. The discovery horrified even the most skeptical scholars. Who were these people? Why were their bodies sealed beneath a place of worship? And why had no records survived of their burial? The most disturbing discovery came from beneath the tower itself. During a partial collapse of the foundation in the early 20th century, workers uncovered a skeleton near the base of the rope well. The bones were curled tightly around a length of scorched hemp, the jaw locked open in a permanent scream. The remains were dated to the late 14th century, the same year the church burned. Scholars debated whether this was the acolyte said to have rung the bells during the fire, or the priest who had cursed his flock. Yet even with evidence laid bare, nothing could explain the continuity of the tolls. How could bones centuries old still command the bell? How could a rope long since burned still be pulled each night? The contradictions persisted. Some experts proposed natural explanations. They argued the sound was a phenomenon of echo and resonance, a trick of the valley's acoustics. Yet this theory collapsed when recordings from inside the tower revealed the sound to be louder than anywhere else. Others suggested mass hysteria, claiming the villagers had passed their fear from one generation to the next. But how did hysteria leave marks on glass, or cause flames to die in lanterns, or inscribe human voices onto wax? Each attempt at analysis ended in conflict. The evidence could not be denied, but neither could it be explained. Every report contained details that should not have existed. Every testimony contradicted the next. The church stood unchanged while the world advanced. Wars came and went. Kingdoms rose and fell. Yet at midnight, the bells still tolled. Scholars argued, villagers prayed, investigators returned to their cities with trembling hands and pale faces. The record remained incomplete. Each piece of evidence was a fragment of a puzzle that refused to form a whole. But one truth pressed against every page, every tape, every broken bone. The tolls were not an echo of the past. They were an act, a deliberate act, repeated each night. The only question was by whom or by what. For the people of the valley, the tolling of the bells was not simply a sound, it was a weight, a pressure that pressed into every thought, every routine, every life lived beneath the tower's shadow. Children were the first to feel it. They learned to count before they learned to speak in full sentences, because every night their parents whispered numbers into their ears, keeping pace with the tolls. 13, always 13. Mothers held their children close, covering their ears, but the sound seeped through wood and cloth. Some children wept. Others stared silently at the ceiling, eyes wide, lips moving as they mouthed the strikes in the dark. As those children grew older, the bells shaped them. They married beneath its rhythm, buried their dead beneath its shadow, and lived their lives bound to the ritual. They did not speak of it often, for what more could be said? It had become the air they breathed, a dread so constant it no longer startled, yet never stopped tightening its grip. Faith faltered. Some villagers turned away from prayer entirely, convinced their church had been abandoned by God, or worse, cursed by him. Others clung desperately to ritual, crossing themselves with each toll, reciting verses in broken whispers as if warding off something unseen. The division split families, neighbors, entire generations. Some saw the bells as punishment, others saw them as a warning. All of them felt the terror. And then there were the outsiders. Travelers who lingered in the village for more than a single night often spoke of an unease that began before the tolls even sounded. They described lying in their beds and feeling watched, as if unseen eyes were fixed upon them. Some spoke of dreams filled with smoke and flames, of faces that turned black with ash, of voices whispering a single word over and over, confess. Others broke down more violently. One merchant, passing through the valley in the late 19th century, woke screaming on his second night. He clawed at his chest until his skin bled, shouting that something was inside him. By dawn, he was gone, leaving his belongings behind. Another visitor, a scholar from the city, spent 3 nights recording the tolls. On the 4th, he was found wandering the streets barefoot, muttering the numbers under his breath, unable to stop. The villagers learned not to ask outsiders to stay. They watched the same pattern unfold too many times. A stranger arrived with curiosity, sometimes with mockery. They heard the tolls once, twice, perhaps 3 times. Then they either fled or broke. The psychological toll was not only immediate, it stretched across generations like a shadow. Young men who left the valley for work returned older, carrying silence with them. They refused to speak of their home, yet they flinched at the sound of any church bell in foreign towns. Women who married into other villages often woke their households with midnight screams, though no bells rang in those places. The bells carved themselves into memory. They did not allow forgetting. Even those who moved far from the valley claimed the sound followed them in dreams. For some, it returned as tinnitus, a phantom ringing that haunted their ears. For others, it became an emptiness, a silence so heavy they could not escape it. Madness was not rare. A handful of villagers each generation lost their minds entirely. They were found muttering in the fields at dawn or pacing the church square at night. Some sat beneath the tower waiting for the tolls with wide, unblinking eyes. They claimed they were listening for something hidden in the sound, not the strike itself, but the silence between each one. They insisted a message was buried there, if only they listened long enough. Others succumbed to paranoia. They refused to let their children near the tower, refused to speak the word 13, refused even to acknowledge the tolls existed. Yet the denial never silenced them. Each night the sound returned, and each night they grew more brittle beneath its weight. It was not only fear that destroyed them, it was exhaustion. To live with the tolls was to live without peace. There was no escape, no relief, no night unbroken by the strike of metal. The villagers carried their dread like an heirloom, passing it from parent to child, a curse bound not by blood, but by sound. In the end, the bells did more than haunt the valley. They consumed it. And still, each night, as the last echo of the 13th strike faded, the silence returned. Heavy, suffocating. A silence that asked a question no one could answer. What debt had not yet been paid? Through the centuries, the bells of St. Aurelia's drew not only villagers and travelers, but also investigators, officials, and scholars who believed they could solve the mystery. Each came with tools, notebooks, and certainty. Each left with nothing but silence pressed against their hearts. The first serious inquiries began in the 17th century. Church authorities dispatched priests to examine the site, expecting to uncover superstition or fraud. The priests stood in the square at midnight, listening. Some returned with trembling hands, insisting the tolls were a divine warning, a punishment for sins long buried. Others dismissed it as devilry, a manifestation of evil bound to the stones. None offered a cure. None dared climb the tower after midnight. By the 19th century, science arrived with stronger confidence. Scholars brought instruments to measure vibration, resonance, and sound. They placed devices inside the tower, on the ground, even buried beneath the soil. Yet their results conflicted. Some instruments recorded nothing at all, even as human witnesses swore the bells shook their bones. Others registered frequencies that did not match iron, instead aligning closer to the human voice. Each attempt left investigators more unsettled than assured. One team of engineers insisted the tolls were caused by air currents striking the hollow of the bell in precise conditions. But this theory collapsed quickly, for the tolls did not falter in storm, snow, or windless nights. The sound came no matter the season, no matter the sky. Another theory proposed seismic vibrations, tiny tremors that shook the valley each night. But no geological evidence supported it, and no other village in the region experienced the phenomenon. As technology advanced, so too did the attempts to capture the truth. Early phonograph recordings revealed voices buried in the metal, I toll, whispering words impossible to decipher. Later magnetic tapes carried the same anomalies, producing tones that analysts compared to human screams stretched across steel. Some claimed to hear the word confess repeated faintly. Others swore the tapes carried no sound at all, though those who listened described feeling sick, dizzy, even weeping without reason. Paranormal investigators brought their own methods. Mediums claimed the church was bound by restless spirits, souls of those burned alive within its walls. They insisted the bells were not a haunting but a demand, a voice for the dead, forcing the living to acknowledge what had been hidden. Some spoke of a priest's curse, others of a ritual gone wrong. Each explanation circled back to the same truth. Something had been left unfinished. But darker theories also emerged. Some scholars argued the tolls were not supernatural at all, but psychological. They believed centuries of fear had created a form of mass hallucination, passed down like a disease from one generation to the next. Yet this did not explain why outsiders, untainted by the valley's history, heard the bells as clearly as those who had lived there all their lives. Nor did it explain the physical phenomena, the shaking glass, the flickering lanterns, the marks on recording tapes. Another theory suggested the bells were not ringing from within the tower, but from beneath it. Archaeological surveys revealed hidden chambers under the church floor, filled with charred remains. Some speculated that whatever lay buried there had not been at rest. The tolls, they suggested, were not sounds carried through the air, but echoes forced through the ground, rising into the iron bell like a voice through a hollow throat. The most unsettling theory came from those who studied patterns. They noted that the tolls did not only mark time, but also marked events. Villagers had long whispered that before each outbreak of illness, before each death that shook the valley, the tolls grew louder, heavier, as if warning of what was to come. If true, then the bells were not simply echoes of the past, they were signals of the future, reminders that whatever bound them was not finished with the living. Yet after centuries of investigation, nothing ended. The priests failed, the scientists failed, the mediums failed, the bells still rang. At midnight, without fail, the sound carried across the valley, steady as a heartbeat. And so the story of St. Aurelia's remained unresolved, a wound no one could close. Explanations crumbled, theories clashed, evidence contradicted itself. Only the tolls endured. 13 strikes, always 13, and no one could say who, or what, demanded them. The church still stands. The stones are blackened, the altar is broken, the windows are empty sockets staring into the valley. No priest has entered its tower for centuries. No villager dares to cross its threshold after dark. Yet every night, without fail, the bells toll. 13 strikes, slow, patient, deliberate. Some say it is the voice of the dead, those who burned, those who were bound, those who were sealed beneath the floor. Others believe it is a curse, a punishment carried forward through generations, a weight that will never be lifted. A few whisper that it is something older than the church itself, something that found a home in stone and iron, waiting for the living to listen. But no one has silenced it. No storm, no war, no collapse has broken the rhythm. The bells endure. And so the question lingers. Are the tolls simply a memory, echoing across time, replaying a moment of horror so powerful it could not be buried? Or are they alive, a hand reaching out from the dark, demanding attention, demanding confession, demanding something no one has yet dared to give? The villagers live with the sound, but they do not speak of it. Travelers still come, and they still leave changed. Some return with pale faces, unable to sleep, haunted by dreams of fire and smoke. Others never return at all. And if you, a stranger, stood beneath that tower at midnight, what would you hear? Would you count 13 strikes, the sound of iron against air, or would you hear something else? Would you hear voices whispering from the stone? Would you hear the cries of the forgotten dead, or would you hear your own name carried in the toll of a bell that no hand pulled, no clapper struck, no priest commanded? The church waits, the bell waits, and midnight is never far away.